the person you see in the mirror isn't you? What if your reflection is just a mask, and behind it, something else is looking back, something trapped, something ancient, and something that has been waiting in the silvered darkness for a very long time? Every mirror holds a reflection, but some, like the one at the Myrtles Plantation, hold souls. This is the story of that glass prison, and the man who tried to look too closely at the inmates. Our story centers on Dr. Aris Thorne, a historian and specialist in antebellum artifacts. Aris was a man of science and verifiable facts, a professional skeptic who viewed ghost stories with academic disdain. To him, hauntings were simply the echoes of human tragedy, misinterpreted by minds eager for a narrative. He was hired by the Historical Preservation Society, overseeing the Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, to catalog and authenticate its extensive collection. He saw it as a prestigious career move, completely unaware he was walking into a place where history isn't just remembered, it's relentlessly relived. The Myrtles Plantation is a place of haunting beauty, a grand antebellum home draped in the drooping branches of ancient live oaks and Spanish moss. It sits under the humid Louisiana sun, its long, shaded veranda whispering tales of a dark and bloody past. Known as one of America's most haunted homes, its very air feels thick with unspoken sorrow. The legends are as numerous as the cypress trees in the bayou. Stories of murder, betrayal, and restless spirits. For Aris, these were just stories, the seasoning that made the historical meal more palatable for tourists. The focal point of the plantation's dark lore, and the object of our story, is a massive mirror hanging in the grand foyer. Its frame is heavy, carved from dark, rich wood, and the glass itself is imperfect, clouded with the subtle distortions of antique manufacturing. Aris admired it as a stunning example of 19th century craftsmanship, but local legend held a darker view. The mirror was said to have been present when Sara Woodruff and her 2 children died, poisoned by a household slave. Crucially, in the haste and horror of the event, no one followed the tradition of covering the mirror, leaving it open to trap their dying souls. Aris began his work with methodical precision, spending long days and even longer nights alone in the silent house, meticulously documenting each piece of furniture, each faded photograph. It was during these solitary nights that he first felt it, a persistent, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the foyer. It was a cold that clung to him, a damp, grave-like cold that had nothing to do with the Louisiana climate. He would feel it most acutely whenever he passed the mirror, but he dismissed it as a draft from the old, poorly sealed windows. The first undeniable incident occurred one morning, after he had locked up the house the previous night. There, on the pristine, polished surface of the foyer mirror, were 2 small handprints, smudged into the glass at the height a small child would stand. They were faint, greasy, and undeniably human. The daytime tour guide, a local woman named Elodie, who spoke of the spirits as if they were her neighbors, simply nodded grimly. "The Woodruff children," she whispered. "They're trying to get out." Aris, annoyed, cleaned the glass himself, attributing the prints to humidity and imagination. As the weeks wore on, Aris's solitude was increasingly punctuated by sound. Faint, muffled whispers seemed to drift from the walls of the foyer, too indistinct to be understood. Sometimes he would hear the soft, sorrowful notes of a woman humming a lullaby, a melody that seemed to come from a great distance. He would stop his work, straining to listen, but the sounds would fade the moment he gave them his full attention. He began wearing headphones, telling himself the old house was just settling, its wooden bones groaning with age and memory. His academic certainty began to fracture one sweltering Tuesday night. He was packing up his equipment, his back to the mirror, when a flicker of movement in the polished glass caught his eye. He glanced at his reflection and froze. Standing directly behind him in the mirrored world was a woman. She wore a high-collared, dark green dress from the 1800s, her dark hair pulled back severely, her face a mask of profound, inconsolable grief. She wasn't looking at him, but past him, her eyes fixed on something he couldn't see. His blood ran cold. He spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The foyer was empty. Sleep became a luxury Aris could no longer afford. The image of the woman in the mirror was seared into his mind. He spent hours poring over the plantation's historical records, searching for a face that matched the one he saw. He found a faded daguerreotype of the Woodruff family, taken just a year before their deaths. There she was, Sara Woodruff. The face was younger, fuller, but the eyes held the same deep-seated sadness. He was a man of logic, but the evidence of his own senses was becoming impossible to deny. The house was not just settling, it was haunted. His mission changed. The cataloging of artifacts became secondary to a new, feverish obsession. Proving what he had seen, he was a scientist, and this was an unexplainable phenomenon. He set up high-resolution digital cameras and sensitive audio recorders, all focused on the mirror. He intended to capture this spectral woman, to record the whispers, to find a rational, scientific explanation for the ghost in the glass. He would debunk the legend by capturing it, by dissecting it with technology, until its mysteries unraveled into explainable phenomena like light refraction or infrasound. The first night of his official investigation was eerily quiet. The house remained silent, the mirror dormant. He sat in the dark, watching the live feeds on his laptop, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and relief. Perhaps it had all been in his head, a product of exhaustion and the power of suggestion. He was about to pack it in when a notification popped up on his screen. The temperature sensor he had placed in front of the mirror showed a sudden, dramatic drop of 20 degrees. The air in the foyer grew heavy and cold, and the oppressive silence was broken by the faint sound of a child crying. He checked his audio levels. The weeping was there, a clear, heartbreaking sound being picked up by his most sensitive microphone. As he listened, another sound joined it, the gentle, shushing voice of a woman, humming that same sad lullaby. He watched the video feed, his breath catching in his throat. The small, ghostly handprints he had seen before were slowly materializing on the surface of the glass, not as smudges, but as areas of condensation, appearing from the inside as if someone in a colder world were pressing against it. Then he saw them. The figures began to resolve within the mirror's reflection, like a photograph developing in a dark room. It was Sara Woodruff, just as he had seen her before. But this time, she was not alone. She knelt on the floor, her arms wrapped around two small children, a boy and a girl, who clung to her dress, their forms translucent and shimmering. They were not reflecting the empty foyer. They were in their own space, a ghostly replica of the room, trapped within the silvered confines of the glass. The children were crying, their faces buried in their mother's skirt. Sara Woodruff looked up, her spectral eyes meeting Aris's through the camera lens. And then, impossibly, she seemed to look right at him, sitting in the dark. There was no menace in her gaze, only a desperate, silent plea. Her mouth formed a single, soundless word he could read clearly on her lips. Help. A wave of empathy so powerful it felt like a physical blow washed over Aris, shattering the last of his academic detachment. These weren't residual energies or historical echoes. They were prisoners, and their prison was the very object he had been studying. As he stared, mesmerized by the tragic scene, a change occurred within the mirror world. A new shape began to form in the darkness behind the Woodruff family. It was not a person, but a fluid, amorphous shadow, a column of deeper blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. It had no face, no features, but it radiated a palpable aura of ancient malevolence and possessive cruelty. This was not one of the plantation's famous ghosts. This was something else, something that served as the jailer, the shadowy entity coiled around the spectral family, its tendrils of darkness reaching for them. The children shrieked, a silent, terrifying sight, and Sara clutched them tighter, her own face contorted in fear. This, Aris realized, was their torment. They were trapped not just in the mirror, but with this entity, forced to endlessly relive their fear and sorrow. This thing was feeding on their despair. It was a parasite, and the mirror was its hunting ground. He knew he had to do something, anything. Driven by a primal, protective instinct he didn't know he possessed, Aris abandoned his equipment and rushed towards the mirror. The air grew so cold, it burned his lungs. He could see the terror on the children's faces, the desperation in Sara's eyes. The little girl's spectral hand was pressed against the inside of the glass. And without thinking, Aris raised his own hand to meet it, his palm flat against the cold, smooth surface. He was no longer a scientist. He was just a man trying to answer a mother's plea. The moment his skin touched the glass, the world exploded. The mirror's surface did not feel solid. It rippled like liquid mercury under his touch, and a shockwave of pure, glacial cold shot up his arm and into his chest, stealing his breath and stopping his heart for a terrifying second. A blinding white light erupted from the mirror, and a soundless scream, a psychic blast of pure agony and fear, echoed not in the room, but directly inside his skull. The force of it threw him backward off his feet, and he slammed into the floor, his vision dissolving into darkness. The last thing Aris saw before he lost consciousness was the scene in the mirror. The shadowy entity, enraged by his interference, was dragging the luminous figures of Sara and her children away from the glass, pulling them back into the swirling, inky depths of the reflection. Sara's eyes were locked on him, her expression no longer pleading, but one of utter, final despair, the look of a soul whose last hope had just been extinguished. Then the light, the figures, and the cold were gone. The mirror was just a mirror again, reflecting the empty, silent foyer. Elodie found him at dawn, crumpled at the base of the mirror. He was unconscious, his skin ashen and cold to the touch. She called for an ambulance, her practiced calm in the face of the plantation's strangeness finally breaking. When the paramedics examined Aris, they found him suffering from severe shock and hypothermia, despite the sweltering Louisiana morning, and burned onto the palm of his right hand, the one he had placed on the glass, was a perfect scarlet welt in the shape of a small child's handprint. Aris spent 2 weeks in the hospital, drifting in and out of a feverish delirium, muttering about shadows and a woman trapped in the glass. His sophisticated cameras and recorders were all wiped, their memory cards corrupted by a massive electromagnetic pulse. The only evidence of his ordeal was the fading handprint on his palm and his own shattered testimony, which his employers dismissed as a mental breakdown brought on by stress and isolation. His contract was terminated, his academic reputation left in tatters. He returned to his quiet life, but the man who came back was not the same one who had left. The confident, rational doctor, Aris Thorne, was gone, replaced by a haunted, anxious shell of a man. He was plagued by nightmares, waking visions of a screaming woman, and terrified children being dragged into an endless darkness. He developed a profound, crippling fear of reflective surfaces. He saw phantom movements in shop windows, in polished countertops, in a still pool of water. To him, every reflection was a potential prison, every mirror a possible cage. His home, once a neat, academic sanctuary, became a fortress against his new fear. He used bedsheets and blankets to cover every mirror. He took down framed pictures behind glass. He even went so far as to paint his windows black, so he wouldn't accidentally catch his own reflection in them at night. He lived in a self-imposed twilight, terrified of what he might see looking back at him from the dark. He knew the entity in the mirror had seen him, had touched him. He was marked. He tried to warn them. He wrote long, frantic letters to the Historical Society, pleading with them to remove the mirror, to destroy it. He told them it was not a historical artifact, but a cage for human souls, and a lair for something monstrous. His letters were ignored, filed away as the ravings of a disturbed individual. The Myrtles Plantation continued its tour, the guides still telling the quaint, romanticized ghost story of the Woodruff family, unaware of the true, parasitic horror that lurked just behind the glass. One day, a package arrived for Aris. It contained a single, small object sent by a Lodi, the tour guide, with no note attached. It was a silver locket he recognized from the plantation's collection. He opened it, and inside were two tiny, exquisitely painted miniature portraits. One of the Woodruff boy, the other of the girl. It was a gesture of belief, a silent acknowledgement from the only other person who knew he wasn't crazy. He clutched the locket, a cold piece of comfort in his self-imposed darkness. Months turned into a year. Aris became a recluse, his only contact with the outside world being brief, necessary trips for supplies. The handprint on his palm had faded to a pale scar, but he could still feel a phantom coldness emanating from it, a permanent reminder of his contact with the other side. He had accepted his fate, a life lived in the shadows to avoid the things that lived in the reflections. He believed, as long as he stayed away from mirrors, he was safe. The legend of the Myrtles mirror continued to grow, fueled by the whispers of Aris's breakdown. It became a new, dark chapter in the plantation's history. Tourists would now specifically ask to see the historian's mirror, the one that drove a man of science mad. They would snap photos, hoping to capture a ghostly handprint or a spectral face, treating the profound horror he had witnessed as a thrilling piece of entertainment. They had no concept of the danger, of the predator that watched them from its cage. One evening, a young couple on a haunted tour of the plantation took a photo of the mirror. They were disappointed to find nothing out of the ordinary. Later that night, back in their hotel room, the woman was idly scrolling through her photos. She zoomed in on the image of the mirror, just for fun. The reflection was dark and murky, but deep within the glass, she could just make out the faint, translucent shapes of a woman and two children, huddled together in fear. But as she stared, her blood running cold, she noticed something else. There was another figure standing with them in the mirrored world, slightly behind them. It wasn't the terrifying shadow Aris had seen. It was the figure of a man in modern clothing, his face pale and etched with a permanent expression of terror. He was looking directly out of the photo, his eyes wide with a silent, eternal scream. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, in his dark, mirrorless home hundreds of miles away. Aris had made a fatal mistake, overcome by a moment of loneliness and a desperate need to feel normal again. He had gone into the bathroom and, with a trembling hand, had pulled back the sheet covering the medicine cabinet mirror. He just wanted to see his own face, to reconnect with the man he used to be. For a brief second, he saw his own haggard reflection, and then he saw the shadow coiling behind him in the glass. He hadn't needed to be at the plantation. The connection had already been made. The moment he touched the mirror, the entity had marked him, tagged him. Looking into any mirror was now an open invitation. He felt an unseen force grab him, not his body, but his soul, and pull. His physical form crumpled to the bathroom floor, an empty vessel, while his consciousness was ripped from the world and dragged into the cold, silvered darkness he had feared for so long. The mirror at the Myrtles Plantation now holds a new prisoner, the shadowy entity, the silent, patient jailer, has added a new soul to its collection. The Woodruffs are no longer alone in their torment. They now have a guardian who failed to save them, a historian who has become a permanent part of the exhibit. His silent scream of warning, now trapped forever, alongside the sorrowful whispers of the family he tried to help. So the next time you pass a mirror, an old one in particular, with dark, clouded glass, pause for a moment. Look closely at your own reflection. Look past your own eyes, deep into the shadows behind them, and ask yourself if you are truly alone. Because some mirrors don't just show you what is there. They show you what they have taken, and they are always, always hungry for more.